I would like to talk about the responsible internet, which in a nutshell is to the internet what responsible AI is to AI. Think about it in this way. For most of us, the internet is like the proverbial iceberg. We see what's happening on the top, on the surface, but we don't actually know what's happening underneath. And this project is very much about digital sovereignty. It is about bringing back three properties: controllability, transparency, and accountability to the internet. So you would like to understand what's happening to your data in transit. You would like to hold those people accountable. The responsible internet as a pillar in networking. We have stated from the start that we do not actually care what protocols are going to run on the internet. So it doesn't matter to us if it's IPv6 or IPv4, or if DNSSEC is deployed or not. We're kind of agnostic to changes on the internet and in the evolution of the internet. What we really care about is, can we influence it? So we try to extend any kind of internet with this new functionality in a bid to increase the trust and confidence for stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean all parties that rely in one way or another on the correct functioning and on the correct operation of the network, further services that are internet-based, right? And you have probably heard by now in recent years that digital autonomy or digital sovereignty is becoming increasingly important. And hence the slide you see here, which I have given the title "Why We Care," may seem oddly outdated. However, I need to remind you, we started talking about this in 2020, and digital sovereignty actually really hit the agenda in the EU, for example, in the last 2 years. And there has been a growing realization now in the European Union, but also elsewhere, that there is a certain dependency on digital services across all our societies. So wherever you live, it's worthwhile to ask if the internet is actually a trustworthy infrastructure and if it's neutral enough for our purposes. And bundled with that is obviously the more important question: who do I rely on? We actually have a very limited insight over dependencies in this huge mesh of operators. In part, as I have said, there are obvious dependencies, like you could say, do you have a routing operator, and that routing operator likes to send data onwards to some other upstream provider, etc., or there may be a documented dependency on some DNS provider. But there's also a ton of undiscovered dependencies. Outsourcing that happens, use of data center lines, all of which could be attacked in various ways. So we don't really understand the deeper dependencies that may come into play here. What we do know is that, at least on the surface, and possibly also to a real depth, is that we have a dependency of a few large, powerful companies that pretty much run the show. I'm not sure if you read the blog by Bert Hubert, for example, who is a Dutch researcher, who has written a very interesting blog post not so long ago, where he compared the services that are offered in the cloud in the United States or North America versus the services that are on offer in the European Union. And in essence, he said that the big difference is that the European Union is infrastructure focused. So they tend to sell services that are run relatively close to the hardware, virtual servers, for example, virtual storage. Whereas in the United States and North America, we tend to get these full stack offers, where you can basically buy an entire database that is administered for you from the application level all the way down to the virtualization layer and below. And we understand none of that. And it is my belief, and I hope that you share this belief with me, that this needs to change. We need to understand this better, and that's why I advocate transparency so much in recent years, and that's why I have teamed up with my dear colleagues from the other universities, who also look at transparency, but who also have this interest in accountability, which I'm also a little bit interested in, and also interested in controllability, which is not exactly my area of research, but I would say I follow it with a certain keen interest. And we believe understanding all this better, and if this only existed, it would have a positive effect on our internet. And this is now the high level surface view of things, basically. But there's, of course, some kind of background story, and that has a lot to do with my own evolution as a researcher on internet and networks. So the storyline of this talk actually starts pretty long ago, even though at that time I did not really think about it, what I was seeing in my own work, namely with flaws in the web PKI in 2011. Mark Oliver is going to remember those times when we were sitting office to office, door to door. And that continued later when I left for Australia and looked at email security and the story of certificate transparency and what could be done with it. And then new technologies that also had to do with transparency, like certification, authority, authorization, a bit of a mouthful, but I'll talk about it later. And then in 2020, just before transparency became my thing, before I actually realized what was happening here, what the joint theme of all this work was, that was the rollout of a new security technology, namely TLS 1.3. And I would like to walk you through all of these relatively briefly, so don't worry, I'm trying not to be too boring here, because it really is also a story of slowly discovering the underlying trends that link one topic to the other. And it's actually funny that it takes so long to understand that what you're looking at is transparency. So all of this in the end led to the effort to build a responsible internet. And I would like to start with these flaws in the web PKI, which is now, well, 13 years ago, quite some time, but it was a paper we had at the ACM SIGCOMM Internet Measurement Conference in 2011. And it actually came out of a completely different desire of mine, because at that time I was still deeply, well, committed to building secure protocols and protocol checking, etc. And for obvious reasons, you know, that was the time of peer-to-peer networking, etc. I wanted to have a really nicely distributed protocol for authentication. And as part of that, I thought, well, before I try to do that, maybe I should actually check out if the web's public key infrastructure does a good job or not, because the web is, well, not really centralized, not really distributed. It's server-based, and we do have some kind of infrastructure there that is meant to issue kind of server passports to authenticate. And I was wondering, is it actually fit for purpose? Let's have a look at that. And what happened was that I never looked back after that. It turned out it wasn't, and I'll tell you now why. So to help you understand the problem, here is what I would call a good operator. I have actually taken my own university here as an example. You see the now infamous lock here that says this site has a secure connection. And back in the day in 2011, that was not the case. Here is a very old screenshot of, I believe, a Firefox browser, where I actually tried to access the website of Symantec in Germany. And it turned out I was getting errors. It said the certificate common name is invalid. What did it mean by this? What it meant actually was, if you clicked on advanced, it meant to say it has a security certificate from Symantec.com, but it is acting under the domain Symantec.de. And something here is wrong, thought the browser. So what you need to understand here is, at that time, Symantec was the global force in the PKI market. I believe they operated 6 or 7 brands of certification authorities, and they had not managed to add their own German internet site to their very own certificate. I mentioned that in a talk I gave at Symantec Research Labs a little bit later, and it was an interesting talk, to say at least. This was fixed, right? So after reporting this issue, it took just 6 years for them to operate new certificates and have a proper website also in Germany. So that was maybe the first hint that the operations of security providers certainly deserve attention. And it was one of the guiding factors, even though it was historically not the first step I took, it was one of the guiding factors in my later research. So what is TLS? TLS sits between the transport layer and application layer on the internet, and it is responsible for confidentiality, so protecting your secrets, and authentication and authenticity on the web, but also used for email. And it has always had many moving parts, in particular this X509 public key infrastructure from the start. The standard is actually older than the domain name system, so that's what we're talking about here, and it has been extended in more recent years with other technologies, which I'll mention later. And there's an idealized view of how X509 should work, which actually comes out of the old idea that we could have directory services, of which LDAP is an example. And they could organize information in trees, and so you could basically have trust anchors, which were called root certificates and stored in so-called root stores, that were allowed to issue intermediate certificates, which were allowed to issue certificates for end hosts on the internet to authenticate themselves to a user. And that's a fairly simple view of the entire thing. Basically, what I did back in the day was to let my desktop computer run for a couple of weeks and crawl the Alexa top 1 million domain. I had a long look at the data, and then I activated basically a kind of continuous monitoring over 18 months to gather more data. And I teamed up with a colleague, not Mark Oliver, but the guy just across the floor, actually, who was monitoring our university's uplink at a 10 gigabit speed. And we soon found out that server operator mistakes and CA mistakes were really, really, really common. But worse, over the 18 months, we found no real sign of improvement. Ironically, maybe, the cryptography was totally okay. So in very few cases did we spot cryptographic mistakes. What we saw all the time was operations that went wrong. To give an example, just trying to find a certificate in the top 1 million domains that at that time that was fully verifiable and issued for the right domain as well gave us a really low number of just 18% of certificates. So more than 80% of the certificates deployed showed errors in one form or the other, and most of them, by far the majority, were attributable to management and to operations. So that was a hint, at least, that something was going wrong. But back at the time, I did not actually think about a broader research agenda that slowly built up. A few years later, teaming up with other people, this time in Australia, and also with ICSI at the University of Berkeley in the United States, we had a look at the same thing again with a bit of a distance and said, okay, what about email? Is email somehow better maintained, better protected than the web, or not? Because we already had a feeling it wouldn't be. And of course, we found out that it wasn't, at least in the general case. What we did find was that the big email providers did it really well. And I can illustrate this here. This is now from Active Scans. And if you have a look at HTTPS, the web for comparison here on the right side, and the 3 email protocols here on the left, just for sending emails, the numbers are not all that different. Maybe a little bit in the case of SMTP with start TLS, but apart from that, there was not so much difference. The same actually for the protocols to access email. None of that seemed, out of the ordinary. It was pretty much what we also saw on the web. But our monitoring at Berkeley showed us a different picture. We could see, obviously, the same issues on the deployed side, that servers, if you break it down to servers, you see quite a lot that are misconfigured, but the number of connections here on the right side, they actually look pretty great. We had the green bars most of the time, and we had verifiable connections. And the reason was simply because most users actually use giant email providers. Very few use small email providers or self-hosted email providers for that matter, and that has an effect. So the story so far here was kind of beginning to emerge that operations matter, and they're often bad, at least in the long tail, which at that time still had some importance because we didn't have this massive centralization of the internet just quite yet. At that time, something new happened because Google was reacting with a standard called certificate transparency to the blatant problems on the web. And this standard had been out for, I don't know, 1 year, 2 years. Security technologies, because more than one had been proposed as an answer to the obvious problems. And this time we focused very much on a large number of domains, taking 280 million domains into account. A big part of our work was on certificate transparency, but also on more, what could I call them, more self-hosting solutions where you would make modifications in the HTTP headers to improve security, for example, by pinning to a certain public key. And we also had a look at a couple of DNS-based mechanisms. And here we saw a new aspect emerge. We saw a clear relationship in the success of a technology in its deployment when three factors came into play and were considered together, namely the effort to deploy it, the risk if you deploy it to your own operation, to yourself, not to the attacker or not to your users, but to yourself as a company or enterprise or organization, and the benefit you obtain from it. So how do you improve your security stance? Short and simple and short and sweet. If it's simple and risk-free, then operators buy in easily. But in most other cases, you have to overcome lots of operator resistance. And in this case, Google was able to push this through and overcome the operator resistance. What is certificate transparency? It's a fairly complex technology where basically you add a further kind of distributed entity to the ecosystem. So you have your CAs at the top that keep issuing certificates, and you have your browsers here at the bottom that verify certificates, but they do one more thing. Now, every time that you issue a certificate, you also have to send it to a neutral log. The log does not care what kind of certificate it actually is. It doesn't do any kind of verification. All it does is it says, this has been issued at the following time. Here is proof. You can send that proof to the browsers. And the browsers can then verify that a certificate has indeed been put into the certificate transparency log. The algorithms used to build these logs allow you to verify that no malicious changes have been made in the past. In essence, what you get is an audit trail for all certificates ever issued by the participating CAs. And the logs themselves are also distributed, so you don't have to trust any single log operator. You can choose between a variety and also compare various logs against each other. The big effort, of course, was to get the CAs to agree to implement that scheme. It's important here to understand this is not a defense. It is not a defense against attacks. It is really all about proving that something went wrong in operations and figuring out who is to blame. And when we looked at the CT ones, there are two CT techniques, actually three, that we had a look at, but only two had some deployment you can consider seriously. Then we saw that the one that was the easiest to implement for the server operators, namely the first one here, that's based on X509 techniques, which had zero effort for the server operator and had zero risk for the availability of your service. That one had a really strong deployment, a surprisingly strong deployment of 7 million. That was pretty impressive, with almost 20% of the top 10,000 websites using it. The others, not so much. Even CT technologies, where Google stood behind it, where the effort to deploy it was huge, it also saw very little deployment. And the same was also true for all these other technologies that we investigated. We found in general very low deployment. And the correlating factor here that suggested a cause, obviously we couldn't check the confounding factors any more deeply, but the cause that it suggested was all of them had medium or even high effort, and they posed a risk to website availability in the sense that if you wanted to use this technology, you had to be really ultra keen not to make any mistake, because otherwise your website would be offline for a good number of your users. And 1 minute of Google time is obviously very, very costly. So if you run a service that has a lot of users, a single minute of downtime is bad, really bad for you. And a few hours or days, even more. So we found that correlation, and that was really interesting. We did acknowledge, of course, that Google was there to push this into the market. And we have to say more about that a little bit again when we talk about the responsible internet, because Google basically had the advantage that they controlled both ends. They had the web browser and they had a lot of important cloud services. And you could simply not afford not to be a certification authority that the Google browser didn't recognize. That allowed Google to push this technology into the market. So that was a story began to emerge here that operations were really important. Still, we also thought, can you do more with such an audit trail? So we had a look at security issues that might be uncovered by looking at the logs and the data they had. And indeed, we found a little bit later, we found some mistakes made by CAs, but also we found that it could be used to detect phishing. For the mistakes made by the CAs, we, for example, had a look at a few of them, and Global Sign, for example, is a big name, still is, and they produced invalid CT data. And the benefit of the audit trail here was simply, we checked it out, we found the mistakes, we reported them, the CAs confirmed it, and then they changed their procedures. So it became clear to us from that you could actually exercise pressure and affect changes in larger entities if only you had some kind of auditing trail that was publicly available. That was pretty cool. We also found that it could identify phishing domains and that kind of data. Why? Because even phishing sites need to have certificates these days, right? You want to have a secure connection to your victim, so to say. And these certificates naturally have to show up in the data. And it was really easy to find a large number of them in the data just with very simple, regular expression-based methods. And the fun part of that was even that entities like the Australian Tax Office became interested in our results and said, can you please send over those domains that imitate ours? We would like to go after them. So that was very nice and showed the potential of having auditing trails. So that was a real an aha moment when you saw, oh, if only you had that data that describes to me how the internet actually works, how much more could we do? We continued in that line. This was all led by TU Munich at that time. I was already in Australia. And we had this further publication where we looked at the Certification Authority Authorization Standard, which was supposed to help CAs and to issue certificates to the right websites. And again, we found that the technology was very simple, but the operations could be really complex. So the standard is just a DNS record, very simple. The operations behind it are complex. And what we saw was that the CAs actually had relatively poor compliance here, but we're getting better. And we are actually, based on it, we're able to suggest some improvements. I'm not going to talk exactly about the 6 experiments carried out in that paper that was led by Quirin from the Technical University of Munich, except that there were certain expected actions taken by the CAs, especially those 4 here that say refuse. Under no circumstances should a certificate be issued. And this experiment was carried out multiple times, each of them twice. And it was very interesting to see that almost always you had, actually always, you had at least one CA that didn't comply. In some cases, they fixed it. For example, here Komodo fixed the outcome of D3 from broken to correct in the second attempt. But there were also a couple of CAs that actually got it right the first time and got it wrong the second time. So we found at least one CA for every test case that did it wrong. And we found a difference in the communication behavior this time. Some CAs were just stellar and they just reacted responsibly to our disclosure and they said, yep, we found the bug, thanks for the report. It won't happen again, and it didn't. And others denied that they had made a mistake at all. That was a very curt reply. Or they actually told us that they had done their own lookups and our DNS entries had permitted their behavior. Well, the thing was this, all of these experiments had taken place using our own server infrastructure, including our very own name servers. So we knew exactly what was permitted at what time. And the CA claiming that the DNS entries were, well, such that they were allowed to their wrong behavior, well, either they are very wrong and it's just a kind of protecting behavior, or someone must have meddled with the traffic in the middle. I don't believe in the latter explanation. So, final part of this talk now is the rollout of TLS 1.3. That was when I was, well, soon to be in 20, just leaving Australia, where we said, okay, TLS 1.2 has been around for a long time, and now it is being replaced with the latest standard, which is much better. And it just happened that we got together and discussed this. My colleague Oliver Holfeld in Kassel and me, for example. Later we pulled in Nazio from Madrid, and Johanna again from Berkeley, and a couple more people that worked on this. And we found, oh, actually, together we have a fantastic data set. We have all these active scans going back all the way to 2017. And we have all this passive monitoring that we have in Berkeley, plus we have the tool from the Android platform, so we actually can get some insight into how mobile devices connect to servers. And we tracked basically how TLS-13 was deployed on the internet, and we found that something new was happening. There were live experiments on the server side from very early on, even before standardization, and the update cycles were rapid, very fast. We found that the reason for that was end-to-end control. The big players today control either the browsers like Google, or they control at least the apps and the server side as well. So that's a primary factor, how they are actually testing new protocols. Or in the case of Cloudflare, you have one provider or one content distribution network that is responsible for a large part of the internet centralization, because Cloudflare is now easily, well, I think they're hosting half the web's domains in the meantime, and clearly they impact the view you have of the internet. Why was this even interesting, you might ask? Because it's just numbers and just operational insights. Well, because TLS-12 had such a very slow uptake, right? TLS-12 was actually defined in 2008. And until 2013, here this red line, I'll explain in a second, there was no uptake. It pretty much was around 0% on servers. No one really cared about this new beautiful security protocol, even though in the years 2012 and 13, the first attacks with real impact became known, like RC4 was really well broken, and Lucky 13 was another attack that really just worked. But they had no big effect, right? You can see the curve staying flat. What happened in 2013, in July roughly, was Edward Snowden suddenly popping up and saying, well, the NSA can monitor what you do. And that seemed to have caused, or at least coincided really suspiciously well, with a sudden uptake in TLS-12, where it rose very fast to about 50% in just 1 year, and then slowly climbed onwards to nearly full global deployment in just 4 more years. And again, the other attacks that became known did not seem to have a particular impact at first, but no one was looking at TLS-13 at that time. Let me explain. Here is TLS-13, and standardization of TLS-13 started also really early. And what we see here is, well, long before the standard was released in 2018, late 2018, we saw the first clients in our monitoring that were actually using it, climbing up to 30% of clients that used it. And even on the server side, we saw movement in the low digits, low single digits, 5% give or take. That was very, very different, right? You had a protocol whose standardization was not even complete, and it was in live use. Plus, after its standardization, you had a very fast uptake, climbing to roughly 20% in just 1 year or so. Looking at this in a little bit more detail, we also saw that actually all these draft versions were already in use, and the moment a new draft was released by the IETF, a large part of the server providers just seemed to switch over like that. And of course, the reason is these server providers were very often one and the same due to internet centralization and centralized platforms like Cloudflare in particular, who quickly implemented the changes in each new RFC draft, and then you deployed it on their servers. So that was really impressive. We also saw a new unprecedented experimentation by a single player with a lot of power, Facebook. Facebook clearly used their own versions, or so it seemed initially, which were identified as Facebook 20 through 23. and they had quite a good number of connections that they were responsible for, up to 10% or so in 2019, but clearly a lot of experimentation going on just before standardization already. And we reached out to Facebook to ask them, what's the difference between your standards and those of others? And they gave us the somewhat surprising answer. Actually, these are the same. These are the same as the drafts. What is happening here, what you're seeing is, we gave them different code points in our own apps so that our own terminating servers could distinguish whether a connection was made by a Facebook app, one that we produced, that would try to speak the new standard with us, right? So Facebook offered a different TLS implementation depending on who was calling their app or someone else. So there was clearly an interest in this, and that was new. So taking all these findings together, right? On the one hand, we see it's good that better security is rolled out fast, but now we see that the big players are really driving the standardization and the deployment, and it's not the academics. Well, it may not be bad at all, actually, but we can certainly say that the high deployment is an effect of internet centralization, the cloud. And then, in that case, the question must be allowed. What does this imply for the development of open protocols? Because now it's the big companies running the show. And if you have a look at the authors of recent RFCs, then you see the big companies play an important role. I'm not suggesting that's bad. What I am suggesting is, are we still in the long run going to address user needs, or are we going to address company needs? Are these the same or not? At least that question is worth asking. And does it actually inhibit choice in the long run, right? Is this going to be a problem for alternatives that don't have the pure power of market share behind it? So I would like to postulate a few key aspects here. I would like to say it's not just a technology. Operations matter every little bit as much, but at least in the past, they have frequently failed to deliver. And I would actually argue they continue to fail to deliver, just in different ways and in different places than before. Internet centralization matters a lot. So a few big operators can single-handedly roll out the next generation internet protocol, right? So what does this mean for the future of the open internet? If only we had deeper insights into network operations, then I would postulate we could make better decisions, hold operators accountable, have better security, and even enable new business models, which is a long way to come to talk from transparency all the way now to the responsible internet. What I have shown you earlier was actually the user perception of the internet is my data gets there. And I challenge you, go out into the world and talk to people. And if they answer it gets there, start asking them what it means. They might actually be a little bit fuzzy on the it, and they might be pretty fuzzy on the there. If you're lucky, you might find that they mention organizations or services or maybe even individuals. What they don't mention in general is network operators on their dependencies, DNS operators, DDoS scrubbing centers, content distribution networks, names, addresses, routes, etc. That's pretty much the same result whether you walk out in the street and ask people there, taking a random sample, or whether you take a convenient sample and ask your own students, right? So the big question is, what's going on under the surface? Which led my co-authors and me to define this term responsible internet. I guess the credit for the new word goes to Christian Hesselmann, first author, who coined the term as far as I know. And this was a paper that basically said, look, based on all our experiences in these last 10 years, here are the problems we need to solve. This is why we think this pillar is needed. This is the research that needs to be carried out. And by the way, we need to think really hard how this can actually be adopted, because any kind of standard or any kind of technology that comes from the outside will find it difficult. We intentionally posit it as responsible internet because there's a term responsible AI that's in the world, and there are similarities here, right? Responsible AI is all about transparency, accountability, and then again responsibility, namely that people and AI have to answer for decisions and errors. And that's very similar to what we do, except we don't have the responsibility here For us, that's more in the accountability already. And for us, it's the controllability, right? So we're not about designing a new internet at all. We are a cross-disciplinary effort to design this responsible internet and figure a few things out. On the transparency side, some obvious questions are, well, which operators transport my data? And actually, how do they process my flow? Which servers do they use? Where are they located? What software is used? And what, maybe most importantly, I believe most importantly, at the moment at least, is what dependencies do they have on others? So the correspondence to responsible AI is really strong here, as it is also for accountability. Basically, if you can force network operators to explain their decisions because they're logged, that would be really useful. If you can understand which functionality has been outsourced, which dependency or software has caused something to fail. I just would like to remind you of the recent XZ failure that may have just, we may just have prevented a little meltdown on the internet where large numbers in the millions of SSH servers might have been open, right? If we could explain and understand that, if we can use telemetry to show that operators deviate and they cannot hide it, that would be very cool. And for controllability, well, it would be good if we had some say. And if by saying we, I don't necessarily mean individuals. I do think that individuals should have a say, but I don't propose to put it on their shoulders to make it their burden. But I do believe that network providers should have a say how data is handled. And it would be good if we had techniques to solve this. So usability for end users does play a role here if you're thinking of it, but it's we view it as a more generalized thing. We are aware that operators are in charge, right? So there are interesting research challenges ranging from how do you model all this, how do you even model the relationships, how do you do the measurements, you have all these variants and conflicting measurements that are actually just normal, you have many vantage points, you cannot be entirely sure how accurate you are, how do you do this? In terms of transparency and accountability, both, this has never been before attempted at such a scale. With easily 3 orders of magnitude beyond certificate transparency, so storage and bandwidth are a concern. They are already in certificate transparency. So maybe we need to look at hierarchies. Which information should be public and which not? That may not even be a technical problem, right? Maybe we need to have some more information from our friends in the social science departments here that tell us something about the governance and the economics. And that is really also a key insight from this project, and one part that I really enjoy working in now. We are not just about the technology. It is true that several of our university partners are, but we do have BARC and we do have one economics department that is looking very much at the economics of such a solution, in the sense of that they are talking to companies and that they're deriving the properties of the responsible internet that are useful for companies and that companies might either be willing to pay for, or taking this further, we're talking to a large telco provider at the moment, can we actually design a product? Can we design a business model that is based on this technology? We also have a collaboration partner and also an applicant at the TU Eindhoven who operate a security operations center, and they are really interested in our data that we gather almost as a byproduct, but that in terms of accountability and transparency comes in a really neat format for them. So they would really like to understand their models for threat intelligence and see if certain defense techniques work better or not. And one thing that they are really after at the moment is scale. The one message we're getting from them is, for example, your data, what it really may be most useful for us is decide what kind of connections we need to monitor and which ones we can just flag more easily as these are okay, because there is so much accountability already behind it. We do public workshops, we have stakeholder workshops, we call all this citizen validation, we've done that already, and it's going to happen again in the new year. So these challenges are addressed in various ways. I spoke about the transparency and the measurements. I spoke about the accountability, where we need the logging and the verification. For the controllability, I didn't mention it so much, but if you are familiar with open and programmable networks like the P4 technology, and if you know that you can add telemetry data in band, then you get an understanding of how this can help us for further controllability and allowing user control, with the user either being individual, less likely, or being a network operator, network provider, more likely. And the key thing really is more and more emerging that we have to focus on these business models and the incentive structures that exist, and that we need to show the real benefit by making good use of our partners who run the Security Operation Center. We've had a fair number of publications. Pretty happy that we had the Usenix this year and a couple of others like Conex the year before, and some measurement conferences. We had some actually really interesting results as complete byproducts. So a Hotnets publication recently identified that a metric for the fairness of TCP connections of the internet could be slowed down. And that was a student's work, in essence, that was more insightful and not actually in the plan, but a very nice byproduct. Or we had a collaboration with the University of Sydney, where we saw that we actually find dependency structures that closely resemble the famous digital divide, that disadvantaged groups actually also have services, internet services at their disposal that by far are not as well provisioned as other services for the majority, right? Not the deepest of insights if you think about it, but then if you think that we are talking here about minority parts of the populations, it becomes highly relevant. We're running our own workshop. I'm also really happy about that one. This year we had to take a break, also in part because the guy who did this has recently become a father, so we postponed our workshop, but trust us, we'll have this workshop again. And this year is not your usual, I have a little paper workshop, I send it there. This year is a discussion-focused workshop, as it used to be in the old days, with hands-on elements. And the feedback we're getting from our participants is that they really like that aspect, getting back together with their colleagues and talking things through. In the end, for me at least, transparency is the unifying element. I fully acknowledged that other people are not so much in transparency, but into other aspects, and that's cool as well. And there are further use cases for the responsible internet that I might not even have mentioned and that you might be thinking of. I would very much welcome any further collaborations, taking this further, etc. But for now, I think I would like to shut up and take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Great. Give me a second. I just shut down the double audio. Thank you so much for the cool and insightful talk, Ralph. It was a great pleasure and super important and interesting topics that you covered. Today I'm also super happy because we have Erkin with us. So here's Erkin. So yeah, thanks for joining, and that will make the discussion even more interesting. And so as typically, I will start a bit. I'll just check. Okay, perfect. Good. So you talked about the internet, and you said people don't know how the internet is actually working, and you gave some details on it, but I would like to break it down even more. So could you tell me with concrete examples what a typical internet connection of myself looks like? With whom do I think I'm talking, and with whom am I actually talking?
I guess you're referring to that one slide I had here, right? What's happening to my data? So first of all, you don't know exactly who you're talking to in most cases. A lot of the services we use today are in the cloud, and the cloud by definition is a set of replicas that may be in various locations. I'm not saying that it's necessarily insecure, but I'm saying the data you access and the server you interact with might not be it is in, and your data may be crossing networks that you don't know about or that you don't want your data to cross. Now, the very, very obvious argument, the one that basically always comes up when I give this talk is, why should I care? All my data is encrypted. And you should care because encryption is not everything. First of all, generally, availability is more important than encryption. And if your data is crossing networks, where other actors can easily reroute and make it slower, or even completely drop it, or store copies of your data or even of your metadata for further analysis that may very much not be what you want, right? And encryption becomes, well, it's fairly standard for web and email, but there are still plenty of protocols that go beyond that, and these are the protocols that people tend to forget about. So talk about protocols where various operators interact, BGP, etc. All these also take a path over the internet because there are tunnels between these sometimes. And you need to think about these as well if anyone can mess with them. But even if you say, okay, I get it, but the cloud, I still trust it. Okay, I'm still fairly much with you because I also use the cloud and I don't think very much about it. But even so, there are other operators that may be just in front of what you think is the cloud. Think of DDoS scrubbing centers, which basically are companies that can stand protectively in the way of an incoming denial of service attack for you. And you don't actually know who these companies are. You don't actually know if your provider has chosen a good one or a bad one, right? And we should never forget that, you know, in the commercial world, maybe that's less of an issue because important and well-funded services may have the money to pay for good providers, but that's not true for administration. We all know from our own administrations that they very often have and must choose the lowest bidder, which is not necessarily the one that has the most resistance to attacks, right? At the same time, we really do want to be able to connect to your administration. Tongue in cheek, in Germany, a lot of it is still pen and paper. So I like to joke that Germany will be operational even if the internet goes down. But in many other economies, it is absolutely commonplace to interact with the administration online. And there are plenty of other dependencies like the ones that I have spoken about that don't interact easily or directly with how your data crosses the internet or even how it is stored, except that there may be dependencies, again, lowest bidder principle, that you're not aware of. Like someone uses an outsourced exchange service. There are plenty of providers of exchange, and they chose the cheapest one. And that happens to be the one that has a security weakness, for example, in their Active Directory, and they don't fix it fast enough. And someone is able to break into it. And it turns out that there are 50 other companies that use the same exchange provider. And now the attacker is in possession of all these wonderful emails, some of which may hold passwords, others hold the personal preferences of users, making them more easily phishable with a targeted spear phishing attack. All of this is really undocumented. Or if you still don't believe me and say I'm really painting a picture that's too negative, did you know that just the simple act of registering a domain is multi-stage? That there are registrars that buy a license from the registry, but then there are sub-companies to whom they outsource and who can offer the same product for a cheaper price, and they are connected in some way to the registrar, maybe electronically, maybe by email. It can be anything, really. There are standard protocols, obviously, but we know actually next to nothing about their security. So what if someone is able to hijack one of these sub-registrars, one of these subcontractors, really? What would happen? Actually, I bet you no one really knows.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was quite a complex answer, so let me break it down again. So the first part of the answer, if I understood it correctly, was if you talk to a service, there are multiple parties in the middle that you might not know, which might be your internet access provider and some transport networks and so on. And then at some point in time, I end up at a resource from the entity I want to talk to, let it be Facebook. And so then the next question of mine, related just to this setting here, we're talking about TLS, SSL, so you were talking about end-to-end encrypted services. So how does this end-to-end encryption go along with your with what you were just telling, that people in the middle get your data? and try to explain it in the sense that not to me, because I mean it's not me necessarily asking the question, but rather to somebody who does not have the experience, in-depth experience of what is happening in this network.
Yeah.
So how does this end-to-end security, where does it get broken, and where is the problem you were just talking about?
See, I told you. You would ask about encryption. I was sure someone would ask the question. It's the first thing that comes to people's mind, because encryption is the one thing that we all know from our experience in the real world, that it exists and that it should protect our data, right? But actually, what do you mean by end-to-end? TLS is not end-to-end. TLS merely connects one process on one computer to a process on the other computer. But it's not end-to-end in the sense of that this is the final application where your data lands. So there is still something in between, very likely, where your data pops out unencrypted of the TLS tunnel, and who knows what might happen to it. Maybe not a big problem for all of us. And of course, I concur that there are security standards that companies must comply with, etc., to handle data on their machines. But my argument actually goes deeper. If we have learned anything at all, then it is that encryption is relatively easy to bypass, right? It's very easy to hijack a server and pretend you're someone, or pretend that you, the attacker, are that service, and most users are going to click through the warning. So just because you say there is end-to-end encryption, I'm not buying. There is plenty of evidence that users click away warnings almost intuitively. So there is a certain percentage of users that would fall victims to the entire thing. And I don't think those users are to blame.
Okay, and to jump in there, but is the conclusion then that end-to-end encryption is useless? We should remove it because it's from a sustainability perspective, just using resources?
No, of course. No, of course. First of all, sustainability, that's not even really true. The encryption layer today costs us very, very little, right? So the hardware is basically built for that. They have special coprocessors even for that, that you can use in special SSL terminators. And obviously it protects you against a certain kind of attacker. No, what I'm advocating is that you need to think very carefully which attacker you are facing. And that depends very much on who you are. You've currently taken the point of view of a user on the internet who may or may not have a substantial involvement with the cloud and has something to lose or not. Okay, and obviously for them it's important that end-to-end encryption, or TLS, exists, because it will definitely defend against the attacker they care about the most, which is the one that is able to inspect traffic connections. So in this picture, for example, the TLS connection is going to protect against anyone just trying to spy on you in AS1, 2, 6, and 8. It does not protect you if you are the user who needs to hide their identity, for example, and there's an attacker who is able to hijack the traffic and reroute, let's say, via AS5, which they control, where they are then able to lock your entire connections, including who you are trying to connect. Still companies that build their own systems. So at the moment, we're focusing very much on the web PKI, which we know does not even work all that well. But there is plenty of other traffic on the internet that is essentially business to business, right? And we would like to have that business to business traffic. And yet we know that building public key infrastructures and doing key distribution properly is one of the hardest problems in security. I would even go as far and say key distribution remains unsolved. And if you don't believe me, then I'm sorry, but the empirical data simply shows that it is unsolved in most cases. And it's not fair to pick out those cases where it does work, which is where substantial flow of money is. Especially, of course, if your goal is that of a more decentralized or internet with more equality, where you don't have only giant operators that provide security, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And now to stick in it again. So now you say, okay, we have end-to-end encryption. So that means we end up somewhere at a service endpoint, and to that one we have the security that current encryption provides us. Okay, let's assume it's secure. And so then you talked about there's a chain of services behind that is doing something. And so the question is, who is this chain? Isn't that just Facebook and its own network and Facebook services? Can't we trust this? Is this really a multi-stakeholder B2B thing? Do you have examples for that?
I do, because we ran a study not very long ago. It's now 4 or 5 months ago, and it was a nice case study where we picked Dutch utility providers, so water and power, electricity, etc. We picked, don't let me lie, let's say half a dozen, maybe a few more. I'm not sure anymore. But that is the right order of magnitude. So just a few case studies. And then we checked if they used the cloud. Those that we used in the end all used the cloud for email. And we knew, of course, which email provider they used. And we basically mapped the internet paths between them and their cloud provider. The reasoning here being, we were interested in attack vectors. Who might be able to sit on the path and figure out who is talking to whom, or who may be able to actually reroute traffic and cause it to slow down or send it to somewhere else for further analysis. We were really interested in who might stage a supply chain attack, in essence, against the utility provider, just in the Netherlands, because the cloud providers had endpoints in the Netherlands. And we ended up with a kind of map where we could show we only have to convince a relatively small number of network providers to roll out this particular security standard, resource PKI in this case, to have end-to-end secured paths, where we could actually make routing decisions based on completely secure paths, in the sense that no one can easily reroute traffic. There are still attack vectors in the context of RPKI. I won't dive too deeply into it, but at least the obvious one can be eliminated. And it turns out that this is not so hard, depending on the cloud provider you use. So how much does it really take to convince your provider and tell them, look, I'm going to pay you, let's say, a few €1,000 more per year to handle my traffic, but in return, you promise me that you choose uplinks that give me that kind of secure path to my cloud provider, and you log it, so I can actually verify at the end of the year if you kept your promise. Okay?
But just to ask in there, so where are we in the connection now? So our TLS secured connection has ended and we're in the part after, or we are still
in the middle? You're in the middle.
Okay, so that means the attack is you have a TLS secured thing, but you have the routing information, and then it's routed to something that might be able to gather some metadata at least, or even to decrypt.
Deviate, destroy availability for a few hours, that kind of thing.
Okay, and is this a country-specific problem? Is that something that is happening in Germany, or rather in another country that is a little bit more controlled?
Happens everywhere, to be sure. It costs you a lot of effort to investigate, because if you try to do it for all relevant sending systems, then you end up in a situation that is just too large. So you have to focus first on the important systems. So you need to figure that out. Who are the important systems? That is where we have a real lack of data, right? There is no kind of list of important companies per country and the networks that they use. So that takes a lot of manual investigation. And then it becomes a bit easier algorithmically, because creating those paths that exist and that can be taken is a fairly well understood standard technique. And there are services and data sets that you can use to determine what kind of filtering of route announcements they use. And then you can check out how many systems on the path already support it. That looks fairly good. There are some short paths where you have 100% security. But if those go down, then you can also show that there are a larger number of systems that don't. And then it becomes problematic. So you could run the same study, say, for France, which might be really interesting if you want to do that. I would be completely supportive. Or for Germany, if you want. United States as well, of course, probably a bit more difficult because of the larger number of operators, but still doable.
Mm-hmm. And to go back to this target of the attacks, so is it something where the regular citizen I should worry about, or is it something that is rather happening with industrial espionage and so on?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned that when we use the term user, more often than not, we're actually thinking of an organization, right? The individual private user, they are much less of a target, right? If you want to get the money of the regular private person on the internet, the simplest way to do that is still probably to buy some ransomware or buy some other kind of malware and deploy it on some website and just harvest, right? I'm not advocating you do that, but it's probably the easiest way still to do it. It becomes a much harder task, and that's why our theme is really digital autonomy or digital sovereignty. It becomes much harder if you're going after an organization, right? And we have seen that to some degree, obviously, in the war now that's going on between Russia and Ukraine, where you could see a lot of operators disconnecting from their Russian counterparts in the wake of that, and that resulting in real changes in internet routing. So they clearly fear that there is a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can generalize it to all organizations that have dependencies that they don't fully understand.
Okay, and so to make explicit what you said implicitly, so they fear that when some traffic comes through Russia, it has been altered or deviated or whatever, and therefore if they disconnect,
Yeah.
obviously they cannot get it from there.
Yeah, or just don't forget availability. Availability is really crucial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, also very important point. And from that, before I hand over to Erkin, last question from mine in the first round. You talked about sovereignty, and sovereignty again is a term that is almost that is not so well understood by many in the audience probably. So could you span the link between what you were talking about and what sovereignty means in that context?
Yes, look, when we discussed this project, and I'm actually really glad you bring up this question. When we discussed this project, the term digital sovereignty referred to a setting where the European countries showed an extreme dependency on companies in other jurisdictions, okay? And that was seen as problematic because it meant that we had an economic disadvantage and that our economy was dependent on the economic decisions far away. Since then, digital sovereignty has become a much more loaded term because we have seen the emergence of nationalist movements across the globe. And that is not what we had in mind, right? So we never felt that we wanted to support a notion of digital sovereignty where we kind of cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, or where we build technology that allows other countries to cut themselves and their population off from the rest of the world. So that is why I often said digital autonomy instead, because it reflects the key idea better, that you have enough resources at your disposal to run your own services and keep your own economic area going without, we're not about avoiding dependencies, we're all about documenting dependencies, right? We're not saying don't buy in America. That is kind of stupid. What we're saying is if you buy somewhere else, you should be entitled to understand what you're buying.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
A simple example that I would like to give you actually is the GDPR, which we don't do much in this project at all, but any kind of privacy policy that you have to go through and to understand where your data is stored, etc., needs to ultimately disclose the data processors and third parties that exist. The GDPR mandates that, and if you actually go through privacy policies, you will find that many don't do it properly. So even there where it's mandated, it's not done properly. And we feel that you are entitled as a paying customer to understand what you're paying for.
Mm-hmm. And so it's thanks a lot for this explanation, because a reason why I also asked it is that in the Gesellschaft für Informatik we currently also have a working group led by Harald Wenes from Würzburg
Mhm.
on this sovereignty. And what I find very interesting is that to the term sovereignty, which typically means to say again what you just said, that we are not the digital colony of the US where we depend on the services, but as you just said, we are also able to provide the services in case needed at least. But what I found interesting is that you bring in another aspect, because you say, okay, the relationship is not so simple, because even if there's a service that is provided by a Google data center in Arizona, for instance, it does not mean that the data is only going to the data center in Arizona, but there is much more involved. And that means this discussion and decision about, am I sovereign right now or not? Or what does it mean that I'm not sovereign, and who has access to the data is way more complex.
Absolutely.
The already complex discussion is suggesting.
And it's transitive, right? So assume you're a network operator, okay? And you run a small local ISP for, I don't know, a mid-sized town. And you have decided to give your money to run your email infrastructure to one company. And then you have given your DNS to some other company. Now we have all these contracts in place.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, you have no way of figuring out if they have further subcontractors.
Mm-hmm.
You have no idea if, for example, the data center is secretly a customer of some other party that may be able to monitor their email traffic and hack them. Of course, contractually, it says that you comply with whatever kind of standards, but you don't know these hidden dependencies, and they're really hard to figure out, especially just by measurement.
Yeah, and so, and also to put that into context, as Ralph also said, we have simple attackers in quotation marks, and we also have state-based attackers that have unlimited resources and can go really far. If you don't know what that means, look at what Edward Snowden revealed in 2011, I guess it was. So it's almost 15 years, and it's still will open your eyes. Okay, so with that, I hand over to Erkin for another question round.
Sure.
Okay, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yeah, yep. Perfectly.
Cannot see you though.
I'm in the YouTube stream, but
it's fine. It's fine. Just talk.
Yeah. So let me start with my own question before the audience questions. So taking advantage of being here and being a moderator. So Professor Holz, one morning you hear that internet went down last night, completely. And what would be your guess for the cause?
My first guess would be the journalist doesn't know what the internet is, right? The internet in its entirety being down would be a true novelty. Normally what my guess would be is they are referring to a part of the internet, and they are actually referring to access to the internet, and they are referring to access provided by a large company. Either that would be my first guess, or what we've seen more recently is services that for a good part of our user population now constitute the internet, right? I would include all the social media there, and I would most definitely include our email providers there. If those services are down, that's what I would think. Like, I think of that famous Facebook debacle where Facebook had some really interesting dependencies. When one of their data centers went down, the chain of dependencies evolved such that the Google search engine was becoming really slow for a few hours. That's probably the internet is down for most people.
Okay, very good. But let me still expand and try to be like the advocate of the devil. So internet, let's think simple. There are routers, cables between them. There are end users, servers and clients in the end that we use some services. Let's say in the core, some of the routers, some of the cables are just went down. It's not only that we can use these services, but really, as the journalist says, the internet went down. So he's not that completely naive, but he has a little bit idea about when he says internet went down, like an infection maybe between the routers that creates endless loops. Those packets are not forwarded, etc., and so on. Where would you first look at? You don't have a connection. You are at home. yeah, what would you do?
Depends a little bit now. So who even told me that the internet is down if the internet is down?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay.
I mean, how did you even reach me?
I mean, this is really teasing to talk about. Yeah, go on.
Possibly, you know, I'm walking on the street and someone tells me the internet is down,
Yeah.
and I look at my phone and I see, yeah, it's true. I'm not entirely sure where you're going with that question. If you're asking me, what would I do? Are you asking, how would I try to find out what happened?
My original, yeah.
Then I would go to my office.
Okay.
Where I have access to a number of measurement points around the globe.
Yeah.
And then I would have a look at what's actually happening. By that time, I guess someone would already tell me what exactly has happened. You know, we have such effects sometimes in regions that are affected by a catastrophic event, some kind of earthquake that takes down the local access to the internet and disrupts entire large regions. And in such a case, I guess we are all pretty helpless, right? The people in those regions won't know. The people outside the region will know pretty well what has happened. And of course, if I am in that region, I cannot tell what happened unless maybe I have one of these fancy Starlink or other LEO kind of access links to the internet, which might enable me to do things that other people cannot. We have one Starlink in Twente, but that's pretty much it, actually.
Let me maybe jump in, because it was an interesting answer and question also. So, and I ask you just as the expert on what is happening in the internet here. So, is multipath routing today something that gained importance because of these high-speed, low latency, multiple access network links, like having a Starlink and a 5G connection and a several gigabit fiber lines, for instance? So, is multipath routing getting more important again? Because when I think back like 15, 20 years,
that's a very interesting question. No. To be quite honest, I don't have any new or fresh data on the prevalence of multipath routing. My understanding is there's more than one way to have a path, right? We used to have multipath TCP already, where the idea was actually to do this on the level of the transport layer. And that, at least when I last looked at it, but it's nearly a decade ago, was mostly used actually for other features. It was not used to bundle connections. That said, when I moved to Germany, right, from a country that had very strong internet to a country that is a little bit struggling maybe with a fast internet, I was surprised to find that my location did not have a cable ISP, that I could only get DSL or 5G or Starlink, each of which has a different provider, none of which are compatible to each other. The solution I actually ended up with for a short time was a 5G connection, which the provider offered to extend with a DSL line. So whenever needed, they basically would use the 5G connection for any further TCP connections they needed to make. As far as I understand the technology they use, they do not bundle over 5G and over DSL, which is a bad idea anyway in the case of TCP because of packet reordering.
Mm-hmm. Of course, but to explicit the background of my question also to the audience, so if you add then again multiple access points to the network core, whatever that is now, but your starting links is already multiple technologies and also multiple intermediaries, this is adding another layer of complexity.
I see where you're getting at, yeah. So basically you would advocate fall-over connections between systems in the core that use a very different kind of link.
Mm-hmm, but in the positive and negative sense. So it might be an attack vector, but it might also be a resilience improvement or even an attestation improvement channel, because some of them might be more secure than others, yes.
I think that's a very interesting idea. And it's actually not the technology that I find particularly interesting about that idea. What I find interesting about it is actually the economic aspect. Does this make economic sense if you assume an economy where supply and demand is still the driving force and you don't have too much collusion or whatever, right? Does it make sense for any kind of provider, especially in the core, to use such backup links, or is the risk of hostile takeover or catastrophic events occurring worth it? And I don't think we have this at all at the moment. They certainly have failover lines, and there are certainly alternative routes that you can take through the internet, and they might be slower. But I don't think there is much of this going on in terms of I have a second link that offers nearly the same speed just via a different access medium.
Okay, cool. So back to Erkin.
There's a very good audience question that I'm interested. So what current developments you are following closely and eagerly, and you cannot wait to see them happening in future?
Oh, that's a very good question. If anything at all, I would say that the hardcore security is what is less interesting these days. Not because it's solved or whatever, but because I'm starting to think that this interaction between technology and operations and technology and society is really starting to play out in a big way. We're seeing more and more of that. If you think of colleagues who have published on how misinformation spreads in the internet, I think it's a really nice example of impactful research where we're slowly understanding the role that the medium has in the development of our society, right? So I wouldn't say that I follow that, but I very much follow these incidental events that occur when networks do something interesting and some larger scale effect happens. I was very interested to see, for example, that in the Netherlands, traffic lights need to be replaced now because they have an attack vector and you can manipulate them. I find that very interesting.
Traffic lights connect to the internet. I didn't know that. Okay.
I think so, yeah. I think that was the part of the reason. And they can be compromised. I found that very interesting because it means that there is something much deeper going on, right? That it's not a whoopsie. It's not just some mistake made somewhere. I think what we're seeing is now a pervasiveness of technology in our daily lives that we are not really prepared for. And a lot of the patterns that we used to employ to think about problems are not all that applicable anymore, right? I mean, who would expect a traffic light to be manipulated by your neighbor?
Yeah. Maybe last question in my round. This is also, I find it interesting. So according to your findings, who is to blame most? End users, ISPs, authorities, politicians, governments, tech giants, and so on?
Yeah, not the users. I do not subscribe to the view that users are stupid. I don't subscribe to the view that the burden of getting everything secure should in any way be on the users. Simply because I think a user has the right to get what they paid for, okay? So it is absurd to me at the moment that we allow tech companies to get away with shipping incomplete and buggy software at very large scale with zero liability. Just all these cloud services that never seem to be complete, this entire attitude of move fast, break things, and fix them when you have time or whatever, that really gets to me. Because for some of these services I'm paying, and I think I should be treated better. That annoys me massively. It annoys me massively that we're seeing organizations and companies using internet technology to hide from the customer. Have you tried to interact with Google as a non-paying customer? You cannot.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and that's also true for other organizations. Even administrations are now very likely not to even give you a phone number or an email address.
Yeah,
they just
true.
say, here's our contact form, and you never can get to them.
Yeah.
And now you ask me who is to blame for this. And I think we need, on the one hand, regulation. A couple of things simply need to be regulated. Accountability is one of them. So that's also tying this back into responsible internet, right? This is where data could come from. And that needs to be regulation. But I also think we need to think more clearly as a society about the economic developments. If you look at the past, this phenomenon of centralization and concentration of power in the hands of a few has happened many times before. If you look at the telegraph, if you have a look at the phone companies in the past, if you have a look at cable, etc., you always see that we have this effect of conglomeration and concentration in the hands of a very few until some disruption comes. And at the moment, I see a real imbalance between the rights of the individuals and the ability to execute and exercise their rights. And that's where I really think regulation is needed. And in the absence of politicians taking that seriously enough, I would advocate donating money to civil organizations, NGOs in other words, that look at your digital rights.
So it comes back to the end users again, who elects those politicians, who should regulate those tech giants. So there's a actual loop. But
fair enough to say that, but thinking that argument through to the end, to the logical end, then all of us are, of us are the end users, right? Even the administration, even the big companies are all end users.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, very good. And I think it's also good, a very good closing statement. Big thank you also for Ekin for having been a co-host for the questions today. Because it's always a big advantage having multiple people, because then you also have different viewpoints and different question lines coming in. Huge thank you to you, Ralph. It was a great pleasure having you, and it was super insightful. And we could have gone on for at least one more hour based on the questions that we still have. And therefore, people can contact you. You gave your contact information, and yeah, thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure, and also super important topic. And I think you managed to really raise awareness of this additional layer of complexity of what this in a black box internet, as we know it from different sitcoms, has become today, and what complexity is in there.
Thank you very much. If I could raise awareness, I think I'm very happy.
Very good. So for all the audience, as always, recommend the series, share the recording, invite your friends for the next edition, and also subscribe if you want to get notified when the next streaming is upcoming, or the website when you want to get the invitations. The next edition is actually the 40th one already. It will be happening on the 29th of November 2024, as usual at 2 p.m. and as usual on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And for the next talk, I'll have Crystal Gaber from Orange, I'll have Gilles Grenaud from University of Lille, and I have Emmanuel Bacelli from INRIA. And they will be talking about an interesting, totally different field, which is the Internet of Things. And they will be talking about multi-tenancy use of this Internet of Things devices. And their title of the talk is Software Multi-Tenancy on Microcontrollers, Enhancing Security with Tiny Part. And with that, thank you for participating, stay safe, and see you next time.
If you share a house with some roommates, you certainly wouldn't want them snooping around your personal belongings. Well, because microcontrollers are becoming
Cher CyberCNI, pôle d'excellence région Bretagne. Au revoir et à la prochaine.